There's just something about old games that stick with you, right? The way they felt, the way they looked. Sometimes they still feel brand new despite the years that have passed. Whether it's the timeless art styles or mechanics that still hold up like a dream, a lot of these games play like they were made for today. In this video, we're diving into some of the best games from the past that are still as playable and visually striking as ever.
Gotcha!
Let's kick off this list with Borderlands 2. You know, something about Borderlands 2 makes it feel timeless, like it doesn't age in the way most games from 2012 do. It's the art style, probably, those thick, comic-like outlines, and the wild, vibrant color palette. Instead of trying for super realistic graphics that could look dated in a few years, they leaned into something more stylized. That choice ended up making Borderlands 2 look fresher than games that came out years later. And then there's the humor. Handsome Jack alone keeps the dialogue sharp and snappy, which helps the game feel alive even today. It's also worth mentioning how seamless the co-op is. Pop in and out with friends, wreak havoc, loot everything in sight. It manages to stay fun every time, something many looter shooters can't quite master. Borderlands 2 just nails that loop. Where the game could start to feel a tiny bit aged is in the inventory management. It's not the worst by any means, but sometimes it's easy to lose track of gear with the sheer amount it throws at you. Might feel a bit cluttered. Still, anytime you get to that moment of opening a fresh loot chest in a boss fight, it hits as hard now as it did then. Coming in next is Prince of Persia: Forgotten Sands. You play Forgotten Sands today, and it can feel like one of those sneaky gems that people overlook. It's not just that it's a Prince of Persia title. That's already enough to give it some history. It's how the whole thing could have ended up being the other Prince of Persia game, but actually stuck around because of how tight the parkour and combat still are. Now, the wall running and the time reversing mechanics. You know the drill if you've played any of the series. But what Forgotten Sands truly pulled off was the seamless fusion of elements. The way you're chaining combat with parkour and then using your time powers made everything feel fluid. Some games have trouble melding movement with fighting, and this game doesn't. It's like one long dance across the rooftops. Okay, physically it's a little more restrained on the textures now, especially for environments. In some places, things don't pop the way they do in more recent titles, but somehow it just gets away with that because the gameplay doesn't let up. You're still right there, flowing through ancient ruins without missing a beat. Next up is Far Cry 3 and 4. I've got to mention these two games as one on this list since I found them really great for its time, and even now. Here's the funny thing about Far Cry. You probably think these games came out relatively recently if you boot them up today, even though Far Cry 3 released back in 2012. That tropical island in Far Cry 3 feels alive. Dense jungles, crystal clear waters, and all those outposts waiting to be liberated. The detail in textures and animations back then was next level. But you know where it really holds up? The villains. Voss and later Pagan Min in Far Cry 4 have a way of pulling you deep into the story. Far Cry 4 keeps the same basic formula as Far Cry 3. Open world chaos, tons of guns, environmental destruction, but shifts it to the mountains of Kyrat. What's fascinating is how much 4 refines the best parts of 3 while adding a few cool tricks like the grappling hook and gyrocopters. It might not be a massive leap between the two games, but it feels like they took a formula that worked and trimmed the fat. Now with that said, the real-time elements can make things messy sometimes, especially when firefights or random events kick off as you're sneaking toward a base. Suddenly, a rare animal's attacking or someone drives by, and it adds chaos. Good or bad, depending on how you handle it. Still, a little chaos is exactly what you're getting into with a Far Cry.
Got some friends, huh?
Up next is Star Wars Republic Commando. Now, this one's interesting. It's not just your typical lightsaber-swinging Star Wars experience. Instead, in Republic Commando, you're boots on the ground as a clone, and it plays out entirely differently than most other Star Wars games. Tactical, squad-based combat felt rare, especially set in such a beloved, nostalgic universe. The control system is pure gold. With a simple command wheel, you can order your squad to breach doors or take sniper positions. It's a streamlined, non-fussy mechanic that keeps the action flowing without ever feeling clunky. This whole aspect aged incredibly well. You don't feel bogged down in menus, you're always in the fight. If you dive into Republic Commando today, even though the textures and models have some blockiness, the atmosphere is still just spot on. Maybe it's the incredible sound design, the clone troopers' helmet filters and blaster fire make it immersive at all times. Little details like that avoid the game feeling dated, even when the visuals show some age. The only thing that might hold it back slightly, I mean really slightly, is the lack of depth and enemy variety. After a while, those droid encounters can feel repetitive, but honestly, the squad mechanics and Star Wars world more than make up for it. You still get attached to your squad, still feel right at home in the galaxy far, far away. Next on the list is Ryse Son of Rome. Visually, few launch titles looked as striking as Ryse Son of Rome. Even today, that CryEngine magic holds up, making its environments and character models look downright stunning. We're talking about those lush forest, burning cities, and these gigantic, heroic Roman statues that still make you stop and admire them. The faces of the characters, with every single detail of their expressions, are somewhere between intimidating and cinematic. It doubled as a tech demo for what the Xbox One could do, but even though there was all this praise around its looks, people are often shocked at how decent the core combat feels if they try it today. Now, combat, it's got a system of hit counters and these badass finishing moves, which honestly never gets old. The thing about it though is it can feel a little repetitive over time. You're doing a lot of the same chains of attacks, even if they come with these gory, dramatic slow-mo kills. Looks fantastic still, just maybe doesn't have the depth some newer games in the hack and slash genre would introduce. There isn't some complex combo system going on here, just a brutal, visceral experience. What Ryse has going for it? The vibe of being part of this epic Roman story definitely stays alive despite a few gameplay limitations. It's kind of like a Roman action movie, played out where you get to be right in the middle of it all.
Is everyone all right?
Barry. Where's Barry?
Next up, we have Resident Evil Remake. Here's the thing with the Resident Evil Remake. Capcom essentially reinvented it, but allowed it to keep the charm of the original '96 game intact. The pre-rendered backgrounds were stunning in 2002, and now there's almost this haunting quality to them. It brings out a weird but brilliant mashup of old-school design with modern revamps. The lighting is perfect for a horror game where turning every corner feels like a risk. The mansion feels so alive, and at the same time, completely dead. There's something about those winding hallways and hidden keys that still make your palms sweat when you play, which is wild considering how many modern horror games have come and gone. Now, the fixed camera angles might throw you off at first if you're used to over-the-shoulder style. People new to the series might not vibe with them as much. But the idea was that it built tension, forcing you to walk into a room without fully knowing what lay inside. Tons of survival horror elements came from Resident Evil, and let's be honest, managing inventory is still just as stressful now as it was in 2002. The remake's visuals, even some nearly 2 decades later, stand out. The Crimson Heads are probably one of the best additions here. Burn those bodies or they grab you way faster and far more terrifying than your standard zombie. Little touches like that keep the gameplay fresh every time they cross your path.
They're really starting to piss me off!
Up next is Gears of War 3. Now here's a game that deserves a spot. Gears of War 3 didn't just wrap up the trilogy. It evolved just about everything the series was known for. The heavy, weighty feeling of moving Marcus and the squad around, the cover-based shooting, the snappy reload system that could make or break a firefight, they're all here, but cranked up to a level where replaying it today still feels completely modern. You can pick it up, roll through waist-high barriers, and chainsaw through locust enemies. And it's right in that glossy space where the performance and visuals hold up well, despite being a game from 2011. Now, the thing about Gears 3 is it also fleshed out the emotion. As weird as that might sound for a gritty, bloody shooter, moments with Dom and Marcus hit harder than they had in the previous 2 entries. You have all this violence and chaos playing out, yet the story carries a certain weight to it, making it way more layered than a mindless action game. Also, the multiplayer mode back then was a classic. Though the multiplayer community is no longer as active as before, it's still a testament to how solid the foundation is. The game could maybe feel a bit dated in some last-gen graphics, but the armored-up characters and set pieces fit right in with today's standards. It's gritty, lived in, and timeless.
Oh, you think you can stop the coal train?
Let's not forget about Serious Sam 3. Serious Sam 3 throws out all pretenses. You're just here to shoot tons of aliens in wave after wave of pure, old-school FPS chaos. Most of the time, you're fighting an entire horde, running backward, bobbing and weaving to avoid explosions, all the while firing off rockets, shotguns, and ridiculously over-the-top weapons. The beauty is that Serious Sam didn't try to evolve too much from its roots. It embraced being part of a simpler, bygone FPS era. Despite Serious Sam 3 releasing in 2011, it stuck to this formula, which helps it feel like something timeless because it wasn't chasing trends. Where it really steps up is in its scope. The levels are massive. It's this feeling of endless space, with wide open fields or giant, ancient ruins, and it somehow doesn't get old. That's part of the charm. It's non-stop action, but the variety of settings makes each round of enemy spawns feel unique in its own way. Critics sometimes felt the hectic nature of all the enemies swarming might feel repetitive. But if you're into mindless fun and pure destruction, there's honestly little to critique. Melee kills and finishing moves add another level of chaos that, sure, might not feel super deep, but works so well in the fast-paced design. The game knows exactly what it is. It's here to give you the thrill of out-of-control non-stop shooting. Time for a change of pace with Sleeping Dogs. This one has a vibe all its own. If there's one game that aged far better than people expected, Sleeping Dogs has to be it. It feels like this underdog of the open world genre from the day it dropped, surprising everyone with just how slick and engaging its combat and storytelling ended up being. Open world games tend to go all in on guns and cars, and while Sleeping Dogs has that, the focus on hand-to-hand combat sets it apart. The counter-heavy system feels fluid, keeping you chaining together brutal moves that make Kung Fu Street Brawls as intense as any shooter. Even today, it doesn't feel dated. It's up there with the best of action games. And then there's Hong Kong. The city has this lived-in quality. It's bustling with life. Markets, neon lights reflecting off puddles, foot traffic bustling through narrow alleys. It's not the largest open world you'll roam, but it's dense in a way that just works now. The sense of place? It's so tangible, which makes it thrilling to explore it, and it's something a lot of open world games struggle to capture even now. The driving might feel a bit stiff at times. It's not GTA 5 levels of refinement, which could pull you out of the experience every now and then. Still, with its combat system and the engaging undercover cop storyline, it's a complete package that sits incredibly well in today's landscape. Real talk, it's an experience that's somehow only gotten better. Let's give a shout out to Remember Me, a game that's been a pleasant surprise. Remember Me slipped under a lot of people's radars when it dropped in 2013, but if you boot it up now, you'll see how its cyberpunk world still feels incredibly ahead of its time. You're walking around Neo Paris, a city drenched in neon lights, oppressive structures, and a tech dystopia vibe that hasn't aged a day. The level design and atmosphere grab you immediately because, visually, it's a stunner. The developers, Dontnod, who later went on to make Life is Strange, created something that feels alive. A city that breathes with detail and intrigue. The game's big feature, the memory remixing mechanic, is the real standout though. The idea that you can hack into someone's memories, alter them, and change their past to impact their future choices still feels incredibly unique. It's not a system many games have tried since, which makes Remember Me pretty special. Each time you go into a memory and mess with details like knocking over a chair or changing how a gun operates, it sticks with you. Just a shame there weren't more of these sequences. Combat did catch a bit of criticism. It's flashy, with martial arts moves and combos you design yourself, but the fighting sometimes lacks the depth you might crave after a few hours. Still, where the game shines, conceptually and in aesthetic, it stays fresh even if certain systems could have gone further. It's that blend of strong visuals and novel concepts that make Remember Me stick in your mind. Up next is Deus Ex Human Revolution. Human Revolution did something incredibly clever in 2011. It took the original Deus Ex vibe and brought it roaring into the modern world while still holding on to the core elements people loved. Player choice, stealth, and a gripping cyberpunk narrative. Adam Jensen is that iconic gravelly voice, and those iconic shades are instantly memorable. The bio-augmentations, they allow for varied gameplay without feeling like any build leads you too far from the core experience. The game has this deliberate pace where every choice feels impactful, and you can feel yourself slipping into the futuristic, conspiracy-laden world as easily today as you did over a decade ago. But it's the hub of Hengsha, this sprawling, multi-layered urban expanse, that showcases human revolution at its finest. You're not just dropped into a cyberpunk city to shoot stuff. You're there to explore the hidden nooks, talk to sketchy characters, and solve problems in varying ways. AI might have aged a little less gracefully, though. In some cases, enemies will make super obvious mistakes like running straight into gunfire. But if you're playing stealthily, letting them do their thing while you take the high ground, you barely notice. For an immersive sim, Human Revolution has aged in all the best ways that matter. Now it's time to mention Infamous Second Son. Infamous Second Son still feels like one of the most vibrant playgrounds for superhuman powers. When it dropped in 2014, it was this beautiful showcase for the new console generation, pushing neon-filled Seattle into your face with reflections bouncing off wet streets and crisp lighting. Honestly, if you explore it today, that graphic fidelity hasn't faded at all. The city is alive with detail that holds up rain-soaked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, and all the powers. They're as mind-blowing now as they were back then. Weaving through the city with Delson's various abilities, neon, smoke, video, each one has a distinct feel that keeps gameplay dynamic. You're blasting through the city as a one-person wrecking crew, shifting between powers, and it honestly doesn't get old. Just flying up vents with your smoke dash or injecting neon into your body to zip through the streets at high speed still feels tight and responsive. And the destructibility of the environment? Very satisfying even after so many years. Now, where it could miss the mark a bit is in mission variety. You're often repeating similar tasks. Take out DUP soldiers, take control of districts, clear a base. It's fun, sure, but a little more variety would have pushed it to even greater heights. What keeps it above the riffraff, though, is the sense of freedom that never leaves. And Delson's narrative, especially his relationship with Reggie, provides an emotional core that gives depth amidst the chaos. Second Son is a great example of how bombastic action and heartfelt story can coexist, even after all this time. Next up is Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. If any game crushed the pirate fantasy, it's this game. Sailing the open seas in your own ship, the Jackdaw, blasting enemy frigates with cannons, and then seamlessly diving underwater or storming an enemy fort, it's a package that still feels fresh today. What Black Flag nails is freedom. You've got this massive open world, and so much of it is ocean, meaning you're constantly discovering sunken ships, new islands, and treasures as you chart your course. Combat still holds up too, especially the ship mechanics. You'll find yourself maneuvering your ship through wild sea battles, and it feels effortless, intuitive even. The ship battles are really what made it stand apart, wasn't it? Even today, games struggle to get naval combat to feel this good. Then there's Edward Kenway. He makes for one of the most likable protagonists in the AC series. His rogue with a heart of gold thing just fits the pirate setting perfectly. Sometimes land combat might feel a bit dated when running through forts or cities, but the real joy is back on the water. The world itself feels like it's teeming with life, a playground of piracy, and you can practically smell the salt in the sea air. For a game that launched almost a decade ago, Black Flag refuses to show its age. Coming in next is Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception. By the time Uncharted 3 rolled around, Naughty Dog had already proven they could weave a cinematic adventure like no one else. And Drake's Deception still holds up remarkably well. You don't play this one for mind-bending mechanics as much as for the big set pieces. There's the plane crash sequence, watching it now, and Nathan Drake is literally clinging to cargo as it tumbles from the sky before getting sucked out into the desert. It's just massive in scale, and even years later, the sheer thrill of it all doesn't fade. Visually, it leans heavily into jaw-dropping locales, from ancient temples to the vast Rub al Khali desert. And even though you know it's a game, there's something about the way Uncharted 3 blends exploration and action that feels smooth. Climbing up ancient ruins while also dodging gunfire could feel clunky in lesser games, but they fine-tuned the movement system enough that it somehow all just fits. And speaking of the combat, while popping in and out of cover works perfectly fine, aiming can sometimes feel a little twitchy. Not a deal breaker, but it's there. Still, pair the wild set pieces with that sharp banter between Drake, Sully, and Elena, and you've got something special that feels right at home, even today. Unfortunately, this game is still a PlayStation exclusive, unlike Uncharted 4, which is now also available on PC.
Get the ranger, not me! He's a much easier target! His sword's broken!
Leave the vermin alone!
Next, we've got Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor. If there's one innovation worth talking about, it's the Nemesis system in Shadow of Mordor. This dynamic, emergent gameplay system where enemies remember you, taunt you, and even seek revenge, transforms Mordor into something that feels alive. You may take down a random orc in a battle as they stumble back into the shadows, only to encounter them scarred later, hungry for vengeance. This feature alone is timeless and still feels revolutionary. Shadow of Mordor puts you in the role of Talion, a ranger with wraith-like powers, blending stealth and all-out brawls in ways that mirror Assassin's Creed, but with a relentless pace. The combat pulls directly from Arkham series DNA, fluid, fast, and brutal. Orcs come at you from all angles, and you use combos and counters to wipe them out while charging up for deadly executions. And it hasn't aged one bit. The open world of Mordor? Desolate, ugly in all the right ways. You roam these brutal lands, taking on towers and orc strongholds, building your legend against Sauron's forces bit by bit. Even now, sprinting into an enemy camp, instigating a fight and watching chaos unfold via the Nemesis system feels innovative. Then Shadow of War follows it in 2017, expanding on that iconic Nemesis system with even more layers. Sure, it got a bit bloated with microtransactions at launch, but ultimately the sequel carried on the dynamic storytelling Mordor kicked off. Together, both games created a lasting space in the action-adventure scene that hasn't been replicated in quite the same way. Another brilliant entry is Jet Set Radio. Jet Set Radio has this energy that you just can't find in modern games. It's like a wild blend of kinetic movement, graffiti, and one of the catchiest soundtracks you'll ever hear. Released back in 2000, you'd think a game this old might feel clunky by now, but picking it up again today, it still feels sharp. The seal-shaded art style with its bold outlines and bright colors makes the game look fresh even after all these years. That art style was ahead of the curve, and not going for realism was the smartest decision the developer made. It's timeless. What Jet Set Radio absolutely nails is movement. Rollerblading through Tokyo as you leap between buildings, grind on rails, and slap graffiti on walls feels fluid in a way that's just as satisfying now. There's something about pulling off perfect combos, chaining together grinds and tricks, all while the soundtrack pulses in the background. It creates this vibe that's totally still relevant. The camera control can feel a little off at times, though. The way it jerks around when you're trying to line up a grind can lead to moments of frustration. It's not a deal breaker, but it's something you feel when compared to more modern, buttery smooth controls in today's platformers. But aside from that quirk, Jet Set Radio just oozes style, and playing it today, you really get why people are so nostalgic for it. Now it's time for Styx Master of Shadows. This game makes you think about stealth in ways that games rarely do these days. You play as Styx, this little goblin thief who's sneaking through massive fantasy castles, taking out enemies one by one, or better yet, avoiding them altogether. The thing that still works today is how the game refuses to let you feel overpowered. You're squishy, vulnerable, one wrong move and you're done. It feels refreshing to be playing a protagonist who has to avoid confrontation, using cunning rather than brute strength to get by. If you're craving some old school stealth action, complete with tightrope walking and hanging from ledges, this scratches that itch. Movement, too, feels super smooth. Climbing walls, slipping into shadowy corners, and using distractions all make it feel like you're dancing through a castle full of threats. Then there are the clone mechanics, where Styx spawns a tiny version of himself to handle distractions or squeeze into tight spaces. That adds a layer of strategy to the sneaking around. Combat, though, it's almost so limited, it's awkward. Every time you get caught, Styx goes into a limited parry system that almost forces you to run rather than fight back. But that's kind of the point. It's a stealth game through and through, and that vulnerability is part of what keeps it tense. If you haven't picked it up in a while, Master of Shadows holds up. And sneaking past guards still has that same nerve-wracking tension. Let's not skip over Torchlight, a game that's an absolute joy to play. Torchlight managed to sidestep comparisons to Diablo with a mix of charm and simplicity that makes it incredibly replayable, even today. Released back in 2009, it keeps its momentum with a colorful, vibrant art style that's cartoonish but still very detailed. That's what's kept it looking good even today. Nothing is trying to be hyper-realistic, so the fantasy world it presents ages like fine wine. It's like every element pops. The dungeons, your pets, even small touches like how loot sparkles on the ground. Speaking of loot, what Torchlight does right is the pacing. You find yourself constantly grinding through dungeons, battling hordes of enemies, and that classic Diablo-style loop is as addictive as ever. It has that same clickfest charm. You're obliterating waves of monsters, clicking on loot, helping to keep you in that one more run mentality, and sending off your pet to sell items for you. That mechanic still feels genius in its convenience, cutting out the backtracking for more action. Where the game might feel a little simplified, especially now, is in its lack of combat depth. You've got spells, sure, and different types of attacks, but mid-game, attacking hordes can feel a bit repetitive. It doesn't swing for deep, complex skill systems, but because Torchlight isn't about reinventing the wheel, it works. That loop of diving into dungeons, leveling up, and constantly getting cooler gear remains irresistible even today, and the vibrant art style keeps it colorful, ideal for quick, satisfying bursts of action.
Nah. Fake.
Up next is the Batman Arkham Trilogy. The Arkham Trilogy isn't just a great set of superhero games, it's a blueprint for how you'd want to feel like the hero. Jump into Arkham Asylum and the groundbreaking free-flow combat system still feels just as sharp. You hit combos with ease, bouncing from thug to thug, countering attacks in a rhythm that feels effortless. It wasn't really about button mashing, it was about feeling like Batman with every single punch. Arkham City cranked that up with a massive open world, letting you swoop across rooftops, grapple up buildings, and put all those combat tools to use in combat and the wider world. Those city streets still feel alive and dangerous if you replay it now. Where the trilogy truly dazzles is in how faithfully it captures Gotham's villains. Mark Hamill's Joker, no doubt, steals every scene he's in. Even today, few games manage to balance narrative and gameplay like Arkham does. The world feels gritty and lived in, while the combat remains slick and punchy. From the tight corridors of Arkham Asylum to the sprawling, crime-filled chaos of Arkham Knight, you're fully immersed in Gotham's underbelly. That said, the Batmobile sections in Arkham Knight, well, they can feel like a slog. Driving parts felt tacked on, and the tank battles sometimes slow the pacing to a crawl. But even that can't take away from how empowering the trilogy feels as a whole. The detective sequences where you piece together clues is still as satisfying as ever. From gliding across the skyline to pummeling a room full of goons, Arkham remains the definitive Batman experience, and time has barely touched it. To wrap things up, we've got Doom 3. This game has left a lasting impression on me and will probably do the same for you. Doom 3 went in a completely different direction when it came out in 2004 and was followed by an expanded and remastered edition in 2012. Instead of the frantic, rip-and-tear action of the original Doom, this one leaned heavily into atmosphere and horror. Imagine walking through dark, narrow corridors with nothing but the ambient sounds of creaking metal, distant monster growls, and then, boom, a demon shows up from a dark corner and it's fight or die. Doom 3 is heavily reliant on jump scare moments, sure, but the intensity of the lighting, or lack thereof, and the sound design is what still makes it memorable. The use of shadows and darkness hasn't aged poorly at all because they rule how you engage in firefights. Flickering lights, broken pipes spewing fog, and the empty Mars base almost act as a character themselves, keeping you on edge. At the time, the whole flashlight versus gun debate had people divided. Back then, you couldn't hold both a flashlight and a weapon at the same time, forcing you to choose between seeing the monster coming at you or being ready to shoot. Some found it frustrating, others thought it cranked up the tension to unbearable levels. Looking back at it now, it does add a different kind of panic that's missing from more recent first-person shooters. Where Doom 3 downsizes a bit is in pacing. It's slower than classic Doom, which means you'll find yourself creeping around corners rather than charging in like a wrecking ball. But somehow, that tension makes it stand up against modern horror shooters in a way that few games from that era still do. It's a trip into a dark, bloody sci-fi nightmare, and it still feels sharp. Next up is Battlefield 3. Dropping in a bonus game here, because Battlefield 3 absolutely deserves recognition in any list about games that aged well. While Battlefield 4 might get a bit more attention these days, Battlefield 3 remains timeless, especially for its large-scale battles. Releasing in 2011, it pushed the FPS genre into massive, destructible environments, and that destructibility still holds up. Blowing a hole through a building to take out soldiers or leveling walls to create new paths never gets old. The visuals in BF3 were absurdly high quality when it first launched, pushing lighting, textures, and particle effects in ways that made every map feel chaotic and alive. That's where Battlefield 3 shines even today. The chaos. Whether it's jumping out of a helicopter, parachuting down into the rubble ruins of a building you just blew up, or hiding behind walls as explosions rip the ground apart around you, it creates these moments where no two matches play out exactly the same. Campaign's good, sure, but really, it's multiplayer that made the game stand out. 64-player servers battling it out in a mix of vehicles, airstrikes, infantry. It's pure warfare on a grand scale. While some of the gunplay might feel a bit slower compared to more recent releases, everything else about playing Battlefield 3 still feels fresh. Plus, when that theme song hits right before a multiplayer battle, you know you're in for something epic. Even alongside newer Battlefield titles, Battlefield 3 still holds its own in a firefight. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into the games you love. Let us know in the comments which of these games you're still playing today, and as always, thanks for watching.